Indie horror was one of the first gaming genres to truly harness the internet's viral potential. Its rise was almost symbiotic with YouTube. Creators needed striking, reactive content,
What the hell is that?
and indie horror games needed visibility. Each fed the other, accelerating the genre's popularity at a pace traditional marketing could never match. Yet at the same time, indie horror would also expose the volatile, fragile nature of internet fame. Just as quickly as indie horror rose to meteoric success, it would fall outside of the public eye completely. A fact that could be primarily attributed to one game, Five Nights at Freddy's. This game would bring a unique style to indie horror, completely upheaving the formulaic game design of the already oversaturated genre. After this, indie horror would rapidly fall off, yet FNAF would have the staying power to outlast the trend. The question is, how? Today I'm going to analyze what made FNAF different from the rest of indie horror, and how it has slowly warped into the very thing it once destroyed. Hi, I'm Nick. From the late 90s to the early 2000s, horror truly carved out its place in AAA gaming, with franchises like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Dead Space becoming household names. And you may notice something that these games have in common. They're all under the subgenre of survival horror, blending action elements with their scares. This style of horror effectively became the only kind that was being put out during this time. As studios chased wider audiences, the horror became diluted. Resident Evil 5 is a perfect example. Barely a horror game, poorly received by longtime fans, yet somehow the best-selling entry in the franchise. AAA horror wasn't necessarily dying, but it wasn't scary anymore. So a vacuum was created. People were still looking for horror experiences, and that's where the indie scene came in. Specifically 2010's Amnesia, The Dark Descent. This game came out in an almost unbelievably perfect time, not just because of what was going on with the gaming industry, but also because of an up-and-coming website called YouTube. Specifically, this was a time in which Let's Plays were beginning to hit their stride, a format that just so happened to be perfect for this game. Speaking of which, we should get into that. Amnesia's biggest selling point was a unique gameplay for the time. It maintained the 3D open environments that have become commonplace, but with one major difference. You had no way to defend yourself. Your goals aren't to defeat enemies, instead you're left to wonder and solve puzzles, all trying to avoid the monsters lurking in the shadows. The game really leaned into its monster designs, which wasn't necessarily foreign. Plenty of games before had great monster designs, but they didn't quite hit the same when you were blowing them to pieces with an armory that would make a US Marine blush. But when you had no weapons, no defenses, just a hiding place and hope, it suddenly felt far more effective. These facts, alongside the game's atmosphere, allowed for a constant tension that would keep players on edge, something that would especially stand out during Let's Plays. The game's lack of action would allow YouTubers to constantly stay at max energy, panicking and screaming and always ready to peek their mic at a jump scare. This made for, at the time at least, great content. Creators like Markiplier, PewDiePie, Jacksepticeye, pretty much any Let's Player you can think of from this era kickstarted their careers playing Amnesia. The other unique thing this game did was its storytelling. Most horror at the time was pretty straightforward with its storytelling, using cutscenes and dialogue to communicate it. Amnesia didn't do this. Instead, the story is told through notes and diary entries the player can find throughout their playthrough. This left things entirely in the player's hands. They had direct control over how much of the story they wanted to experience and when they wanted to experience it. This added even more to the content side of things, as this indirect storytelling method allowed YouTubers and viewers alike to try and piece together the story as they went. Now, with all of this being said, despite the impact and influence this game had on the titles that would come, it wasn't necessarily a viral sensation, at least not by today's standards, but it would inspire something that was. Something that would truly push the Amnesia-like style into the limelight. Slender the 8 Pages. This game was simple, yet it built upon the principles of the prior game perfectly. They trimmed the fat with things like story and puzzles being entirely neglected, and instead focused solely on the environments, monster designs, and more jump scares than a 2012 Let's Player could shake a blue Yeti at. You just wander the woods attempting to collect the titular 8 pages, while trying to avoid the looming Slender Man. The game would become massively successful on the internet. with countless creators garnering millions of views playing it. While Amnesia may have laid the foundations for the style of horror, Slender sensationalized it. It would be followed by many indie horror games following in its static footsteps, with plenty of spin-offs and a sequel, as well as new IPs like Outlast and Cry of Fear. This solidified indie horror as the primary form of horror gaming. At least, it did, till August of 2014. A game was released that would take the best elements of the aforementioned titles and blend it with some unique ideas, and it would do so to such an effective degree that it would kill indie horror as we knew it. Of course, I'm talking about Five Nights at Freddy's. This game on the surface appeared to trim the fat even more. This was no longer a walking sim going from jump scare to jump scare. Instead, you couldn't walk at all. The jump scares came to you. Another major deviation came from the character designs. These weren't your typical scary monsters. Instead, they were uncanny animatronics. This lack of graphic content opened up the game, and therefore the videos playing it, up to a new audience, kids, and this certainly played a factor in the game's massive reach and success. Markiplier's first FNAF video sits at over 129 million views, numbers that dwarf Slender's peak. After this game, Amnesia-like indie horror would vanish. So the question is, what made FNAF different? I made my comedic jabs a few moments ago, but there really is more to it. The first is the gameplay. Beyond its content creation appeal, the gameplay was simply different. It moved away from the unengaging walking simulators and instead made it a resource management game. This brought agency back to the players, as there was an actual degree of skill required to beat it, and when you got jump scared, it was because you made a mistake. This also plays into the game's general approach to horror. It didn't just rely on creepy character designs and loud jump scares. Instead, it placed a focus on atmosphere and sound design to create this incredible tension. The characters also stood out as, despite not being outwardly horrifying, they created their own sense of unease. They leaned into the realm of uncanny, focusing on taking something that should be seen as innocent and nostalgic and perverting it. So, not only did it offer fresh gameplay, but also a fresh style of scare. Furthermore, it had another offering that differed from its competitors: its approach to storytelling. If you thought it was enough that this game was basically perfectly crafted for the Let's Play trend, then you lack ambition. This game would create an entirely new niche of content creation that would carve out an equally large slice of internet relevance, if not bigger these days: theory and lore videos. On the surface, the story was simple. There was a set of animatronics that got a little quirky at night, owned by a comedically negligent company, and you had to survive them long enough to get your minimum wage paycheck. But if you look closer, keeping an eye out to small pieces of the background and to the many random events throughout the game, you'll find something a bit deeper. Newspapers will tell you of a series of disappearances that took place at the restaurant. 5 kids who were lured by a suspect wearing one of the mascot suits. Later, the location would be closed due to reports of foul odors coming from the animatronics. This took Amnesia's method of basing the story on player engagement and amplified it. It focused on presenting a mystery as opposed to a story, something that could be pieced together, but not necessarily fully understood. These concepts allow the franchise to survive the death of indie horror, and the death it likely caused. And it also created a new wave. I think a slept-on aspect of FNAF that contributed heavily to its success was its simplicity, specifically because it was so easy for fans to recreate in projects of their own. While Amnesia had their custom stories and Slender had fan games like Slender Man's Shadow, these were just fun little bonuses for their respective fandoms. FNAF fan games created their own fandoms. In 2014, the same year the first FNAF game was released, Five Nights at Treasure Island dropped. Inspired by the creepypasta abandoned by Disney, this game was just a demo. But due to its success with YouTubers like Markiplier playing it, a full game was set to be in the works. Unfortunately, it would go through development hell, passing from person to person, until finally an indie studio called Radiance Team would take over, finally releasing the finished game 6 years later. In 2015, we would get what was probably the biggest FNAF fan game, Five Nights at Candy's. This game would get millions of views on YouTube, leading to multiple sequels and spin-offs. It would eventually get picked up by the Fazbear Fanverse Initiative, a project in which popular fan games were chosen by Scott Cawthon to be funded by him. This would also allow the games to make merchandise and just generally profit off their franchises without worrying about copyright issues. While these FNAF fan games were phenoms in their own rights, FNAF's influence wouldn't stop there. There was a new era of horror forming. Games that would take the gameplay of Amnesia likes and blend it with the most viral aspects of FNAF, specifically the character designs. This would become what we now know as mascot horror, games which focus not on making their characters scary or unsettling, but instead marketable. They would often follow the FNAF blueprint of taking something nostalgic and child-friendly and making it creepy. The first of these was Tattletale in 2016. This game followed a kid having to survive an evil Furby before Christmas, more or less. The game itself isn't particularly notable, but it was early and it was popular, getting millions of views on YouTube, like most of the games I've talked about. The year after, we got Bendy and the Ink Machine. This game had a mascot inspired by classic cartoons, who was eventually brought to life by the titular machine. This game was also hugely viral, and is considered a pillar of mascot horror. It introduced a chapter format. For this game, I don't think it was too bad. All 5 chapters were released in the span of a year, and only 3 of them charged for it, $5.99 each. Once they were all released, the full game was put together and sold for $20. Unfortunately, this system would be utilized by others and regress with time, with other games in the genre using the format in more predatory ways, but we'll get to that. These games wouldn't just borrow FNAF's character design philosophy, they would also utilize its style of storytelling to varying degrees of success. For example, Hello Neighbor. This game would release a viral alpha in 2017, with many people latching on to the mysterious story. Unfortunately, the full game would come out and was not well received. The game was just not very good. With the gameplay failing them, the developers, Tiny Build, would try to cling to the story, which would devolve into them just begging MatPat to talk about it on Twitter. Of course, I can't talk about the explosion of mascot horror without mentioning Poppy Playtime. This game was the one, to me, that had the biggest impact on the modern state of FNAF. Not only was it massively successful on the internet, but it was also incredibly successful financially. It immediately spun off into merchandise, ARGs, and even has a movie in the works. It was also the game I alluded to earlier when talking about the chapters. They started out reasonable, but the last 2 chapters each charged $20 for an experience that lasts a few hours. This is full game pricing for something that objectively isn't a full game. It also led to an incredibly slow release cycle, with 5 chapters releasing over the course of 5 years, and they keep dragging it out. In general, the people behind this, Mob Entertainment, are some of the greediest motherfuckers in the world, and unfortunately they've found massive success off the back of this game, with most people not bothering to look into their past. Which sucks because the people in charge are genuinely horrible human beings. Regardless, the game itself was probably the best example of the final deterioration of the Amnesia formula. It is quite literally go from point A to point B, solve a puzzle, do a chase sequence, $1 billion please. Regardless, successes like these would certainly have an impact on the coming future of FNAF. It was the moment when the genre FNAF unintentionally created began to overshadow it, forcing the franchise to adapt in ways that would eventually strip away what made it unique in the first place. At the time of these games' successes, FNAF was in a bit of a transitional period. With the release of Ultimate Custom Night, the main storyline had been mostly concluded, and Scott decided it was time for a change. He passed it off to a team called Steelwool Studios, who would release a FNAF VR game before announcing they had officially begun developing the first AAA FNAF game, Security Breach. This game would be a massive departure from the original game's stationary resource management gameplay and audio-focused horror. Instead, it was an open 3D game in which you had to avoid enemies by hiding, solve puzzles, and survive chase sequences. Feels familiar, doesn't it? The original FNAF trapped you in a coffin-sized office with nothing but a desk fan and your own panic. Security Breach drops you into a mall so bright it feels like a Fortnite map. The game would have a mixed reception. It had a rocky release full of bugs and glitches that practically ruined the experience. The game also just wasn't scary. You see, early FNAF had a balance. Yes, it used intentionally unscary designs, but it paired them with an environment and atmosphere that would make them unsettling. Security Breach abandoned this. Instead, you're in a brightly lit mall with no real focus put into audio beyond occasionally listening for animatronic footsteps. On a grander scale though, the game would succeed, particularly at bringing in a new audience. The game effectively brought in a second wave of FNAF fandom, ready to piece together the story of this new era. This would carry over into the next game, Secret of the Mimic, which would have a far better launch and was praised for having the best narrative of the series. But for longtime fans, those who have been around before Security Breach, something about this game was unsatisfying. Even Markiplier, the king of Five Nights at Freddy's, the man who put this game on the map as much as it put him on the map, had this to say after beating Secret of the Mimic.
I miss it. You know, when you have your favorite food from your childhood or something, and you're eating it, and you've been looking forward to it for a long time, you haven't had it in years, and then you go to take a bite, and you realize that they changed the recipe. And it's not that it's not good, but it's not what you've really wanted, you know?
And I think he's right. FNAF was a game that built its legacy on being different, a break from the oversaturated internet fad that was indie horror. But it's changed. It feels like Steel Wool is desperate not to make another FNAF or even something unique to the genre, but rather to just make another Poppy Playtime, another viral mascot horror game that would take the internet by storm. And in doing so, it's not really FNAF anymore. It's just another mascot horror game. Just another 3D walking sim filled with shoddy puzzles and chase sequences. It's just another Amnesia-like. And now with slow release cycles, cancelled projects, and a franchise that feels increasingly disconnected from its roots, FNAF's future is more uncertain than ever. The first 7 games were released in 4 years by one person. The last 2 took nearly 8 years with a team of over 60. And so that brings us to now. FNAF is still incredibly successful financially, especially with the movies, but with recent releases it's unsure how long that will last. Over the last decade, we've watched FNAF kill a genre, create a new one, and slowly morph into the very thing it once destroyed. And now we very well may be seeing its downfall. But maybe that's just the fate of every genre-defining game. Eventually, the imitators become the blueprint, and the original becomes just another face in the crowd. But what do you think? Is FNAF dying? Has it become just another Amnesia-like? Let me know in the comment section down below, and feel free to do all the other YouTube stuff while you're down there. If you've made it this far into the video, with the utmost sincerity, thank you, and I will see you around. Bye.